The train's whistle screamed across the Colorado wasteland like a dying woman's last breath, and Clara Bell Monroe pressed her trembling fingers against the window glass, watching her old life disappear into dust and regret. She was 21 and had never been touched by a man, yet here she was, hurtling toward a stranger's bed in a God-forsaken territory where women were bought like cattle and dreams went to die. The letter in her reticule promised security, but her heart knew only the cold terror of surrender. Subscribe to discover how one child's question will shatter everything Clara thought she knew about love. The depot at Dead River Junction squatted against the horizon like a wounded animal, its weathered planks gray as old bones under the merciless Colorado sun. Clara Bell Monroe stepped from the train car with legs that trembled not from the journey's length, but from the weight of what awaited her in this forsaken place. Her traveling dress, once the pride of her mother's careful stitching, now hung limp with dust and the sweat of fear, clinging to her slight frame like a shroud. The platform stretched before her, empty save for a few scattered souls who looked as lost as she felt, their faces etched with the particular desperation that drove people to the edge of civilization. She clutched her carpetbag with white knuckles, feeling the weight of her few possessions and the marriage contract that had sealed her fate like a death warrant. The air tasted of alkali and broken dreams, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled with the hollow sound of a funeral dirge. Behind her, the train hissed and groaned, preparing to continue its journey to places she would never see, carrying away the last connection to the world she had known. The conductor, a grizzled man with eyes like chips of flint, helped down the last of the passengers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had witnessed too many farewells. Clara Bell watched as families reunited with tears and laughter. Lovers embraced with desperate passion, and businessmen strode away with purposeful steps, all of them belonging somewhere in this vast emptiness, while she stood alone with nothing but a stranger's promise. Her reflection in the train window showed a pale ghost of a woman, green eyes wide with terror and auburn hair escaping its careful pins like her composure was escaping her control. The marriage broker's words echoed in her memory like a curse. Thaddeus Kane is a good man, child, a provider who needs a wife and mother for his daughter. But good men, she had learned, were often the most dangerous of all. The sun beat down with the intensity of divine judgment, and Clara Bell felt the first beads of perspiration gather at her temples as she scanned the platform for the man who had purchased her future. She had memorized his description from the letters: tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver and eyes the color of winter storms. The marriage broker had spoken of his ranch, his reputation, his need for a woman to bring order to his household, but never once had anyone mentioned love. Love was a luxury that mail-order brides could not afford, a fairy tale for women who had choices instead of desperation driving their decisions. Clara Bell had signed the contract with hands that shook like autumn leaves, trading her virginity and her freedom for the promise of security in a world that offered women precious little of either. Now, standing in the suffocating heat of this alien place, she wondered if she had made a bargain with the devil himself. A shadow fell across her path, and Clara Bell looked up to see a man approaching with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command. He was exactly as described, yet somehow more intimidating in the flesh, his presence filling the space around him like a gathering storm. Thaddeus Kane moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his weathered face carved from granite and his eyes holding secrets that could break a weaker soul. His clothes spoke of prosperity, fine wool despite the heat, boots of quality leather, a hat that had seen use but not abuse. Yet there was something untamed about him that no amount of civilization could fully contain. When he stopped before her, Clara Bell felt the full weight of his scrutiny, as if he were evaluating livestock rather than greeting his intended bride. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with all the words they had never spoken and all the intimacies they would be expected to share. "Miss Monroe," he said finally, his voice carrying the rough music of a man who spoke more to horses than to people. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. He removed his hat with a gesture that might have been courtesy or mere habit, revealing hair that was indeed touched with silver at the temples, giving him an air of distinguished authority that made her feel even younger and more foolish than her 21 years. His eyes, those winter storm eyes she had been warned about, studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, yet she found herself trapped in their depths like a bird caught in a snare. There was pain there, old and deep, the kind that carved lines around a man's eyes and taught him to trust nothing and no one. Clarabelle realized with a start that she was not the only one who had entered this arrangement out of desperation. When he offered his arm with the formal politeness of a stranger, Clarabelle placed her gloved hand upon it and felt the solid strength beneath the fabric of his coat. They walked in silence toward a wagon that waited at the edge of the platform, its presence as imposing as the man beside her, built for function rather than comfort in this harsh land. The horses that stood in harness were magnificent beasts, their coats gleaming with health and their eyes alert with intelligence, and Clarabelle found herself thinking that Thaddeus Kane was a man who cared for his animals better than most men cared for their wives. As he helped her into the wagon seat, with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength, she caught a glimpse of something that might have been kindness in his expression. Though it vanished so quickly, she wondered if she had imagined it. The moment her feet left the ground, Clarabelle Monroe ceased to exist as she had been, and became instead the property of a man whose heart remained as mysterious and forbidding as the territory that stretched endlessly before them. The Kane Ranch emerged from the prairie like a fortress built against the cruelties of an unforgiving world, its buildings arranged with the strategic precision of a man who understood that survival depended on preparation and strength. The main house stood 2 stories tall, its white-painted walls a defiant statement of prosperity against the brown monotony of the landscape, while outbuildings scattered around it like protective sentinels guarding against the wilderness beyond. Clarabelle felt her breath catch in her throat as she took in the scope of the operation. Corrals filled with horses that moved like liquid poetry, barns that spoke of careful maintenance and abundant resources, and everywhere the signs of a man who had carved success from the raw materials of determination and will. The wagon wheels crunched over gravel that had been carefully laid and maintained, and she realized that Thaddeus Kane was not merely surviving in this harsh place, but thriving with a completeness that made her previous life seem small and insignificant. As they approached the house, she could see curtains in the windows and flowers in carefully tended beds, evidence of a woman's touch that had been absent for too long. The front door opened before they reached it, and Clarabelle's heart nearly stopped as a small figure appeared in the doorway, like a vision from a dream she had never dared to have. Lucy Kane was 5 years old and perfect in the way that only children can be, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and eyes that held all the wonder and trust that the world had not yet managed to steal from her. She wore a blue dress that had been carefully mended in places, and her small feet were bare against the wooden porch, giving her an air of wild freedom that spoke of a childhood spent running through endless spaces under an infinite sky. When she saw the wagon approaching, her face lit up with the kind of joy that adults spend their entire lives trying to recapture, and she began to bounce on her toes with barely contained excitement. Clarabelle felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Colorado sun and everything to do with the sudden, unexpected recognition of what she had been missing all her life. This child, this beautiful, motherless child, was the piece of the puzzle she had never known was incomplete. Thaddeus brought the wagon to a stop with the easy competence of a man who had performed the action thousands of times. But Clara Belle barely noticed his movements because her entire attention was focused on the little girl who was now running toward them with arms outstretched and laughter spilling from her lips like music. There was something heartbreaking about the eagerness in Lucy's approach, the desperate hope of a child who'd been waiting for someone to fill the empty spaces in her world, and Clara Belle felt her own fears and uncertainties fade in the face of such pure, uncomplicated need. When Thaddeus helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his expression as he watched his daughter's approach. This was a man who loved deeply and completely, she realized, but who had learned to guard that love like a precious treasure that could be stolen or destroyed by the careless cruelties of fate. Lucy reached them in a whirlwind of motion and excitement, her small hands reaching up to touch Clara Belle's skirt with the reverent wonder of someone encountering magic for the first time. "Papa, Papa, is this her? Is this the lady who's going to live with us?" The words tumbled from her lips in a rush of breathless anticipation, and Clara Belle found herself kneeling without conscious thought, bringing herself down to the child's level so that they could look into each other's eyes. What she saw there took her breath away, not just the innocent beauty of childhood, but a loneliness that matched her own, a hunger for connection that had been carefully hidden behind smiles and laughter, but was now laid bare in this moment of meeting. Lucy's hands were small and warm as they reached out to touch Clara Belle's face with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that the world could be cruel to those who loved too freely. "What's your name?" Lucy asked, her voice soft with wonder, and Clara Belle felt her heart break and heal simultaneously as she looked into those trusting eyes. "Clara Belle," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotions she could not name, and watched as the little girl's face transformed with delight at the sound. "Clara Belle," Lucy repeated, testing the syllables like a new song. And then, with the devastating directness that only children possess, she asked the question that would change everything. "Can you be my mama?" The words hung in the air between them like a prayer, simple and profound and absolutely impossible to ignore, and Clara Belle felt the last of her defenses crumble in the face of such naked hope. Behind them, she heard Thaddeus draw in a sharp breath, and she knew without looking that this moment was as unexpected and transformative for him as it was for her. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of possibility, with the recognition that three broken souls had somehow found each other in the vastness of the Colorado Territory and discovered that their individual wounds might heal if they were brave enough to trust in something larger than their fears. Clara Belle reached out with trembling hands to cup Lucy's face, feeling the soft warmth of her skin and the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath her fingers, and knew that whatever happened between her and Thaddeus Kane, this child had already claimed a piece of her heart that would never be returned. "I would like that very much," she whispered, and watched as Lucy's face exploded into a smile so bright it could have powered the sun itself. In that moment, Clara Belle understood that she had not come to Dead River Junction to marry a stranger, but to find the family she had never known she was searching for, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that led not to new places, but to new versions of ourselves. When Lucy threw her small arms around Clara Belle's neck and held on with the fierce desperation of someone who had been waiting her entire short life for this moment, Clara Belle felt the last of her terror transform into something else entirely, a fierce, protective love that rose up from the deepest parts of her soul and promised that she would move mountains to keep this child safe and happy. Over Lucy's shoulder, she met Thaddeus Kane's eyes and saw her own wonder reflected there, along with something that might have been gratitude and the first tentative stirrings of hope that their arrangement might become something more than a mere transaction between strangers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kane ranch as Clara Bell stood at the kitchen window, watching Lucy chase a stubborn chicken around the yard. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and the child's laughter had become the soundtrack to her new existence. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, marveling at how quickly the terror in her chest had transformed into something warmer, more complex. The coffee in her cup had grown cold, forgotten as she observed the way Lucy's small boots kicked up dust clouds that danced in the golden light. This was not the life she had imagined during those endless train rides, trembling with fear about what awaited her in Dead River Junction. The child's innocent question still echoed in her mind, creating ripples of possibility she had never dared to consider. Thaddeus emerged from the barn, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the morning sky. Clara Bell's breath caught as she watched him move with that particular grace of a man who had learned to read danger in every shadow. His reputation as Iron Cane preceded him like a storm cloud, yet she had witnessed moments of unexpected gentleness when he thought no one was watching. The way his calloused hands had carefully braided Lucy's hair that first morning, the soft murmur of his voice as he read her bedtime stories, the protective stance he took whenever strangers approached their property. These glimpses of the man beneath the legend made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. She found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the careful way he moved, as if he carried invisible weights that only he could feel. The sound of Lucy's delighted squeal drew her attention back to the yard, where the child had finally cornered the wayward chicken near the water trough. Clara Bell smiled despite herself, remembering her own childhood attempts to catch the chickens on her father's modest farm back in Missouri. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. A girl who had never stood in a stranger's kitchen wearing a wedding dress that still hung unworn in the wardrobe upstairs. The ceremony had been postponed indefinitely, Thaddeus claiming they needed time to get acquainted proper-like before making their vows official. She suspected his hesitation had more to do with her obvious terror than any concern for propriety, and she was grateful for his unexpected consideration. Lucy burst through the kitchen door like a small whirlwind, her cheeks flushed with exertion and her dark hair escaping from its careful braids. "Miss Clara Bell, did you see me catch Henrietta? Papa says she's the smartest chicken we got, but I'm smarter." The child's eyes sparkled with triumph as she tugged on Clara Bell's skirt, demanding attention with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never known rejection. Clara Bell knelt down to Lucy's level, smoothing the wayward strands of hair back from her face, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "I saw everything, sweetheart. You were very clever indeed." The endearment slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt a flush of warmth at Lucy's beaming response. This was dangerous territory, this growing attachment to a child who might never truly be hers. The kitchen door opened again, and Thaddeus filled the doorway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. Clara Bell rose quickly, smoothing her skirts and trying to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs whenever he was near. "Lucy, go wash up for breakfast," he said quietly, his voice carrying that particular authority that brooked no argument. The child scampered off without protest, leaving Clara Bell alone with the man who held her future in his weathered hands. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like morning mist. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. When she finally gathered the courage to meet his gaze, she saw something there that made her breath catch, a hunger that had nothing to do with the breakfast she had been preparing. "You're good with her," Thaddeus said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Clara Bell nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing too much of what she was feeling. The truth was, Lucy had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a fierce protectiveness, a tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that this arrangement was becoming something more than a simple transaction, something that could break her heart if she wasn't careful. As if reading her thoughts, Thaddeus stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent that seemed to cling to his skin. "She's been asking when you're going to be her real mama," he said quietly, and Clarabelle felt the world shift beneath her feet, like sand in a desert wind. The afternoon heat shimmered across the prairie as Clarabelle hung laundry on the line behind the house, her movements automatic while her mind wrestled with the implications of Thaddeus's words. Lucy's question about becoming her real mama had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter, beautiful and painful at the same time. She clipped one of Lucy's small dresses to the line, noting the careful mends in the fabric, evidence of a father's clumsy but devoted attempts at domesticity. The wind caught the garment, making it dance like a ghost of childhood innocence, and Clarabelle found herself wondering about the woman who had worn this dress before her, the mother Lucy barely remembered, but whose absence shaped every corner of their lives. From the kitchen window, she could hear Lucy's chatter as she helped Thaddeus prepare for his afternoon ride to check the cattle. The child's voice carried clearly on the still air, full of questions about everything from why horses needed shoes to whether angels had wings like chickens. Thaddeus answered each query with patient seriousness, never dismissing her curiosity or treating her like the child she was. Clarabelle had noticed this about him from the beginning, the way he spoke to Lucy, as if her thoughts mattered, as if her small observations about the world deserved consideration. It was a tenderness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. Yet she was beginning to understand that Iron Cane was as much a mask as the polite smile she had worn during her journey west. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from the laundry basket, shading her eyes against the sun to see a rider approaching at a leisurely pace. She recognized Tom Bradley, the town's deputy, a man whose easy smile and frequent visits had not gone unnoticed by the other women in Dead River Junction. He dismounted near the front porch, his movements casual, but his eyes alert as they swept the property. Clarabelle felt a familiar flutter of unease whenever strangers appeared at the ranch, a reminder that her position here was still uncertain, still dependent on the whims of a man she barely knew. She smoothed her hair and walked toward the house, arriving just as Thaddeus emerged from the kitchen with Lucy perched on his shoulders. "Afternoon, Cane," Bradley called out, his voice carrying that particular blend of respect and wariness that most men used when addressing Thaddeus. "I thought I'd ride out and check on how you folks are settling in." His eyes found Clarabelle, and she saw something there that made her skin crawl, a speculation that felt invasive and presumptuous. She moved closer to Thaddeus instinctively, seeking the protection of his presence even as she told herself she was being foolish. Lucy waved enthusiastically from her perch, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that seemed to crackle in the air like electricity before a storm. "Hello, Deputy Bradley. Papa's teaching me to rope cattle, and Miss Clarabelle makes the best biscuits in the whole territory." Bradley's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes as he looked between Clarabelle and Thaddeus. "Is that so? Well, I reckon you're a lucky little girl to have such a fine arrangement here." The pause before the word arrangement was deliberate, loaded with implications that made Clarabelle's cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She could feel Thaddeus tense beside her, his body coiling like a spring under pressure, and she knew that Bradley was walking a dangerous line with his insinuations. The deputy seemed oblivious to the warning signs, or perhaps he simply didn't care, secure in his badge and his assumption that Thaddeus wouldn't risk trouble with the law over a mail-order bride's reputation. "Lucy, go inside and help yourself to some of those cookies we made this morning," Thaddeus said quietly, lifting the child down from his shoulders with careful hands. His voice was calm, but Clarabelle could hear the steel beneath the surface, the promise of violence that had earned him his fearsome reputation. Lucy skipped toward the house, chattering about cookies and completely unaware of the storm brewing between the men. Clara Bell wanted to follow her, to escape the uncomfortable weight of Bradley's scrutiny, but something in Thaddeus's posture told her that running would only make things worse. Instead, she stood her ground, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised her with its strength. Bradley's eyes lingered on Clara Bell for a moment longer before returning to Thaddeus, and she saw the exact moment when the deputy realized he had overstepped. The easy confidence drained from his face, replaced by the wary respect of a man who had suddenly remembered exactly who he was dealing with. "Well, I should be getting back to town," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he mounted his horse. "You folks take care now." He rode away without looking back, but Clara Bell could feel the weight of his speculation following him like dust in his wake. As the hoofbeats faded into the distance, she realized that their peaceful interlude was over, that the outside world had found them and would not be easily dismissed. Evening settled over the ranch like a gentle benediction, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Clara Bell of the stained glass windows in the church back home. She sat on the front porch steps, watching Lucy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, the child's delighted laughter mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Thaddeus sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, yet far enough away to maintain the careful distance they had observed since her arrival. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with the awkwardness of strangers trying to find common ground in an impossible situation. "She's happy," Clara Bell said softly, nodding toward Lucy, who had managed to cup a firefly in her small hands and was examining it with scientific curiosity. The words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested, an acknowledgement of the change that had come over the child since Clara Bell's arrival. Lucy had blossomed like a desert flower after rain, her natural exuberance no longer tempered by the careful watchfulness of a child who had learned too young that the adults in her life could disappear without warning. Thaddeus nodded, his eyes never leaving his daughter's small figure as she released the firefly and watched it spiral upward into the darkening sky. "She is," he agreed, and Clara Bell heard something in his voice that made her heart clench with unexpected emotion. The sound of Lucy's footsteps on the porch boards announced her approach, and Clara Bell opened her arms automatically as the child climbed into her lap with the unconscious trust that still took her breath away. Lucy smelled of sunshine and adventure, her small body warm and solid against Clara Bell's chest as she settled in for what had become their evening ritual. "Tell me about the fireflies again," Lucy demanded, her voice drowsy but determined to fight off sleep for as long as possible. Clara Bell smoothed the child's hair, marveling at its silky texture as she began the familiar story about fairy lights and wishes carried on gossamer wings. She was aware of Thaddeus watching them, his gaze intense and unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Miss Clara Bell," Lucy said suddenly, her voice small and serious in the way that only children could manage. "Are you going to stay forever and ever?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge, demanding honesty in a situation that had been built on careful evasions and polite pretenses. Clara Bell felt Thaddeus go still beside her, his attention focused on her answer with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. She looked down at Lucy's upturned face, seeing trust and hope and a vulnerability that made her chest tight with emotion. This child had already lost one mother. The thought of causing her that pain again was unbearable. Clara Bell began, then stopped, realizing that whatever she said next would change everything between them. The truth was, she no longer knew what she wanted, no longer recognized the frightened girl who had stepped off the train just days ago. That girl had been prepared to endure a loveless marriage for the sake of security and respectability. But this woman, sitting on a porch in the middle of nowhere with a child in her arms and a man beside her who made her pulse race with possibilities, wanted something entirely different. She wanted to belong here, to be part of this small family that had somehow claimed her heart without her permission. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Yes," she said finally, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm going to stay forever and ever." Lucy's face lit up with pure joy, and she threw her small arms around Clarabelle's neck with enough force to nearly knock her backward. Over the child's head, Clarabelle met Thaddeus's eyes and saw her own wonder reflected there, along with something deeper and more complex that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out slowly, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on Lucy's back, and the simple touch sent electricity racing through her veins like lightning across a summer sky. "Then I reckon we should make it official," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "The preacher's coming through next week for the Henderson wedding. If you're willing, we could—" He trailed off, but Clarabelle understood what he was asking, what he was offering. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a real partnership, a chance to build something lasting and true in this harsh and beautiful land. Lucy had fallen asleep in her arms, her small body completely relaxed in the trust that only children possessed, and Clarabelle knew that whatever choice she made would affect all three of them for the rest of their lives. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she felt the last of her fear fall away like autumn leaves, replaced by a hope so fierce and bright it took her breath away.